Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into a practice that, for many of us should feel like the purest and sweetest fellowship we have. We're talking about prayer.
Mm,
And yet, if we're being honest, it so often feels fraught with anxiety, with performance pressure, or just plain confusion.
that's so true. We all feel it.
We worry, am I saying enough? Am I saying it right? Are my words powerful enough to, I don't know, break through?
And that tension you're describing, that exhaustion of feeling like you have to perform for God, that's the very issue Jesus gets to in the heart of the Sermon on the Mount.
So that's our focus today.
Right. We are zeroing in on Matthew chapter 6, specifically verses 7 and 8. And our sources really push us to analyze what Jesus is teaching on prayer against the backdrop of, well, of deeply ingrained human habits.
The habits of his day.
The habits of his day, which were, both the religious formalism of the Jewish leaders and also the wide-ranging pagan superstition that was all around them.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive is clear. We want to try and isolate the true theological foundation of Christian prayer,
Mm-hmm.
because the central tension is this. Does God listen more carefully because we use more verbal technique or maybe more words, or because we speak out of a confidence that's rooted in who he is?
And the sources all point in one direction. They affirm that the critical difference between, let's say, noisy, manipulative prayer and simple Christian communication is not a matter of style.
Yes.
It's not about how long you pray.
It's not about the technique.
It's not the technique. It's entirely a matter of theology. It comes down to what we believe about the character of the God to whom we pray.
So if we can extract that core doctrine successfully today, we're really offering you, the listener, a way out, a kind of freedom from that performance anxiety that can turn devotion into just another human technique.
A way to rest.
A way to rest. Okay, so let's unpack this by setting the stage. We need to get the context within the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 6 isn't just some random collection of rules. It's Jesus's sustained instruction on the nature of what he calls kingdom righteousness.
He's redefining what it means to be righteous.
He is. He's showing his followers what true obedience looks like, and he's contrasting it sharply with the external piety that had become the standard display among the religious leaders of that time.
The whole point of the kingdom is that the inward motive has to outweigh the outward display.
And that's such a key point, because Jesus is arguing that even when you're performing acts of righteousness, things God actually commanded, the human heart is fully capable of corrupting them through self-interest or, as we'll see, just plain faulty theology.
So true.
And to make this point, Jesus tackles three sort of representative religious duties that were central to Jewish life.
The big three.
The big three: almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. And in each case, he follows the same pattern. He gives a warning against perverting it, a sharp distinction between the true and false way to do it, and then a promise of reward from the Father.
And it's really interesting that prayer gets the middle position, and it also gets the most extended treatment. It's almost like it's the hinge between how we treat our neighbors, which is almsgiving, and how we treat our bodies, which is fasting.
Right. So let's look at the first distortion Jesus addresses. We can call this the horizontal error, hypocrisy, or, as our sources put it, prayer as religious theater.
Love that phrase.
It's so good. Jesus targets those who pray to be seen by others. He says they deliberately choose prominent locations, synagogues, busy street corners, wherever they can perform their devotion for human applause.
It's all about the audience.
It's entirely man-centered prayer.
Yeah.
They are looking for human validation, not divine communion. And the warning Jesus gives is just stark. He says they have already received their reward.
That's it. That's all you get.
The praise of the spectators, that's the payment in full.
So that first critique addresses the human-centered corruption of prayer, where your motive is warped by wanting public acclaim. But then, starting in verse 7, Jesus just pivots. He abruptly addresses a completely different distortion.
The vertical error.
The vertical error. This is paganism, or prayer as technique.
What's different here?
Well, what stands out is that this second critique isn't about wanting human praise. It's driven by a distorted, superstitious view of God himself. Jesus draws this clear line between his disciples and the Gentiles, the pagan nations, and he exposes a theological error that's actually, I think, much more widespread and persistent than just religious showing off.
And that's why Matthew 6, verses 7 and 8 is such a critical hinge. It transitions right from critiquing the hypocrites, false motives toward man, and it sets up the model of the Lord's Prayer, the pattern for true prayer.
It's arguing that genuine prayer has to be totally separate from both Jewish external formalism and, maybe more dangerously, Gentile superstition, which is a trust in manipulation.
Okay, so let's turn to that specific error of the Gentiles. Jesus commands, "Do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words."
That phrase, heap up empty phrases, is from the Greek word batologus, and the sources say the best translation is just babbling.
Babbling.
Just babbling. It describes speech that is verbose, mechanical, and, basically meaningless. It's just noise.
But the problem isn't the volume of the noise, is it?
No, not at all. The problem, according to the sources, is the logic behind the noise. The issue is trusting in the sheer quantity and the execution of the words themselves, rather than trusting the character of the God to whom you're speaking.
So why? Why do they feel the need for this kind of verbal overkill? What's the thinking?
Well, it all flows from what the sources call a theology of manipulation. And it's driven by three specific and deeply faulty assumptions about what God is like. Assumptions that I think we often unconsciously import into our own prayer lives today.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first assumption is that of a reluctant or inattentive deity.
A reluctant God.
Yeah. Pagans didn't believe their gods were necessarily all-knowing or all-powerful or even always available. Their gods were often distant, maybe asleep, maybe busy fighting other gods, or just plain indifferent to human suffering.
So if you start with that assumption, that the deity is distant or asleep, then you have to generate enough internal force and external volume just to get their attention. You have to overcome their apathy.
You have to wake them up.
You literally have to wake them up.
You have to work hard just to secure their attention. Think about it. If a judge doesn't know you or care about your case, you have to talk louder, longer, present overwhelming evidence of your need just to get past that initial barrier of their disinterest.
That makes sense. And that brings us to the second assumption. If the deity is reluctant, then your tools have to be pretty powerful.
That's right. Assumption 2. Trust in verbal magic.
Verbal magic.
Because the gods are seen as capricious, pagans believed that success in prayer relied heavily on, verbal quantity and technique. They treated prayer less as communion and more as an incantation.
Like a spell.
It's a belief system where saying the right words, the potent formula in the right sequence, and often enough, can somehow force the god's hand or unlock a desired blessing.
So the power isn't in God's wisdom.
No. The power is located in the human speech act.
It's in my words.
In your words. And this leads right to the third assumption, which is the logical conclusion. An attempt to control.
Of course.
When the power is in the technique, prayer stops being a petition and it becomes a lever. It's seen as a tool to, twist the God's arm or maybe just wear down heaven through sheer, exhausting verbal repetition and intensity.
It's an attempt to manipulate the outcome through your own performance rather than submitting to a divine wisdom.
That's it.
And we see such a perfect, visceral Old Testament illustration of this with the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. I mean, it's just an incredible scene.
Well, it's amazing. They were crying out from morning until noon, shouting the name of Baal, leaping on the altar.
And even cutting themselves to draw blood.
Cutting themselves. They believed that intensity and duration were what was necessary to generate the energy required to compel Baal to act.
So Jesus is identifying the underlying logic there.
Right. The assumption that the necessary force to effect change has to originate from the worshiper's strenuous effort, not from the inherent character of the divine being.
I think we can all relate to that feeling of exhaustion. If we try to modernize that analogy, the pagan method is kind of like the desperate salesperson.
Oh, that's a good picture.
Imagine a client who is clearly distracted. They're texting under the table. They're looking for the door. The salesperson starts talking louder, rapidly increasing the tempo, cycling through the same points again and again.
Just a verbal barrage.
A verbal barrage. They're hoping that the sheer weight of words will prevent the client from walking away and finally just force them to close the deal just to get them to stop talking.
And that dialogue isn't about a genuine relationship.
Not at all. It's about control and overcoming reluctance through force.
And that comparison really highlights the emotional burden. That kind of prayer is utterly exhausting.
Because you're shouldering the responsibility for the outcome. If the prayer fails, it's because your words weren't fast enough or loud enough or correct enough. The failure is on you.
What a terrible way to approach the creator of the universe. It shifts the burden of effectiveness onto the creature.
It does.
So now we get to the radical contrast, the true foundation of Christian devotion. Because Jesus doesn't just condemn the bad method. He surgically replaces the entire faulty pagan theology with a single, staggering truth. A
Yeah.
truth that invalidates the need for babbling entirely.
This is it. This is the living foundation.
He says, your
Okay.
Father knows what you need before you ask him.
And if we just sit with that for a moment, if we unpack that brief statement, it contains the entire doctrinal basis for restful prayer. It provides the only relief from the exhaustion we were just describing.
So let's isolate the two great theological axes contained in that one statement.
Let's do it.
Axis 1 is divine omniscience. That's the God knows part.
Mm-hmm.
Our sources define God's knowledge as exhaustive and immediate. It's not knowledge he gathers over time or learns from observation. No, it's complete. It covers all things actual and possible, all events, all hearts, all needs perfectly.
Yeah.
He knows what is, what was, what will be, and even what might have been.
And the critical phrase is that this knowledge exists before you ask him.
That is monumental. It's so big, it means that prayer, categorically, is never information transfer.
Okay, let me push back on that a little, because this is where I think many of us get caught up. If we're not transferring information, and he knows before we ask, why does Jesus still command us to ask? Doesn't asking still functionally feel like we're informing him of our need?
That's the key tension, isn't it? And we have to wrestle with it. But the reason it's not information transfer, it's theological. He is not some busy official we have to brief on the details of a case.
We're not filling gaps in his awareness.
Not at all. The pressure to explain everything perfectly is eliminated because his knowledge isn't external to him. It's identical with his infinite being.
So when we talk about the reformed understanding of God's sovereignty, the doctrine of decree, it implies that the timing, the means, and the ends of all things are already established.
Right.
And because God has ordained both the means, which is prayer, and the ends, which is the answer, well, the logic of using many words to update him or persuade him on what to do, it just collapses completely.
It does. He doesn't need to be convinced. He needs to be acknowledged. You don't have to talk loudly to get the attention of one who has never, not for a fraction of a second, ceased to see you or know the precise molecular structure of your immediate need.
Wow. And that delivers us to Axis 2, which elevates this truth from just a simple, maybe even scary fact to an overwhelming comfort, and that is divine fatherhood.
This is the game changer.
The your father knows part.
The hearer is not a generic, distant, or indifferent deity. The hearer is your Father. And this single word transforms the entire context of the transaction from a fearful one to a personal covenant relationship.
This defines true prayer as fundamentally filial, which means the speech of children. And this is the radical distinction that separates Christian devotion from every other religious system on the planet.
It stops being the groveling of slaves trying to placate a harsh master.
Or the bargaining of clients appealing to a reluctant bureaucrat.
Yes. You are speaking to one who knows you personally, loves you sacrificially, and is willing to hear you unconditionally because you are his child.
So why do these two attributes, omniscience and fatherhood, why must they always function together?
Because omniscience alone, if you just sever it from fatherhood, is terrifying. An all-seeing, perfectly aware deity who is hostile to you. Well, that would drive a sinner to hide in shame, not rush to speak in confidence.
I see. But the combination of the two.
The combination is the source of what our sources call restful boldness. It means the believer speaks to one who is both perfectly aware of every circumstance, every sin, every weakness, and is perfectly willing to hear and act on behalf of his children.
So we can rest in the confidence that he never stopped watching, never stopped knowing, and never stopped loving.
And that combination fundamentally shifts the purpose of prayer. We move from an attempt to move God toward our will to an attempt to move our will toward his knowledge.
The sources capture this so well, using the contrast between a courtroom and a family dinner. Let's stay with this analogy for a minute, because I think it makes the distinction really practical for people.
It's a great analogy.
In a courtroom deposition, which is like the pagan model of prayer, you must be exhaustive, you have to be repetitive and precise.
The judge doesn't know you.
He doesn't know you, and he requires every single fact to make a decision. If you leave something out, you lose the case. Your words fail to perform.
Right. But at a family dinner, which illustrates Christian prayer, a child just says, "I'm hungry." Or maybe they don't even say that. They just start to fidget.
And the parent doesn't need a 10-minute monologue detailing the child's caloric intake deficit. That's the omniscience part.
No, of course not. They simply know the child's need, and they desire to feed them. That's the fatherhood part.
So the child speaks to commune and to express dependence. not to inform the parent of some unknown data point. The precision of the words simply isn't the point.
And if the child's words are clumsy or broken or repeated, the parent still hears the need behind the clumsy speech because of the relationship. They're not judging the grammar.
That understanding, the doctrine of the omniscient Father, it radically changes the practical nature of prayer. It is the liberation we need to escape the exhaustion of all that religious striving.
It shifts the entire focus from the quality of our words to the truthfulness of our heart.
And since the Father comprehends the need before any request is even formed on our lips, the need for verbal clarity is just. It's fundamentally simplified. The pressure to provide exhaustive details or the fear that if I leave something out, God will miss the point, that's completely removed.
We are not expected to brief God adequately.
What a relief. And this decisively removes the need for any kind of verbal magic or performance. Believers are liberated from needing ornate language or special vocabulary or some kind of expert tone.
You don't have to generate the force or volume necessary to move a deity. Prayer doesn't have to be a performance aimed at controlling a reluctant God. It can just be the honest, unvarnished speech of a child.
Let's go back to that desperate salesperson analogy. In that scenario, the salesperson feels this immense pressure to use persuasive rhetoric and complex arguments.
Right. The whole outcome depends on them.
But in contrast, the child praying to the Father is free from all that pressure. If the child's speech is clumsy or repetitive or halting, the Father sees beyond the form to the dependence in the heart.
Knowing the Father sees the heart allows for honest imperfection. We are free from the pressure of polished rhetoric in our private devotions. A believer can come with, halting, broken sentences and still be completely heard.
You can genuinely pray, maybe not even out loud, just thinking the words. Lord, I don't even know how to articulate this fear. This is what I need, And you just rest entirely in his prior knowledge and his wisdom. You don't have to worry if the prayer is long enough or impressive enough to count because the value of the prayer rests in his character, not your execution.
And this realization replaces that anxious striving we talked about with what the sources term restful boldness.
Restful boldness.
When we grasp that the Father's knowledge is perfect, we understand that he already distinguishes perfectly between our short-sighted wants, the things we think we need right now, and our real spiritual good.
That's a huge distinction.
It's huge. And this freedom means we can stop trying to twist his arm or trying to wear down heaven through sheer repetition of a specific desired outcome. We can pray with confidence, knowing we speak to one who understands what we should want better than we understand it ourselves.
Okay, so this brings us back to that big question I raised earlier. Why do we pray if he already knows? If God is sovereign, and he has decreed all things, and he knows what we need before we ask, is prayer just a formality? Is it just going through the motions?
No, it's not a formality. The sources hold to the consistent doctrine that prayer is a means of grace. It is appointed not to inform God, but to change the believer.
Oh.
God has ordained prayer to draw us into active conscious fellowship with him and to compel us to consciously acknowledge our poverty and his sufficiency.
So we pray because he commands the means, even though he has already decreed the ends.
That's it. The act of asking is fundamentally an act of dependence. If we stopped asking because he already knows, we would stop being consciously dependent, and that relationship, that fellowship would just wither.
So prayer changes us, not God's mind.
Because his mind is already perfect.
It's perfect.
We are the ones who benefit from articulating our need because it reinforces our status as dependent creatures speaking to an omniscient Father. It trains us in humility and trust.
The sources really show how Jesus's critique of Gentile babbling provides a powerful doctrinal plumb line for examining modern errors.
Oh, absolutely.
We might think we've moved past paganism, but so often modern theological movements just repeat the Gentile mistake, just dressed up in Christian terminology.
The underlying logic is always the same. You're transferring the power of the outcome from the divine character to the human performance.
Let us start with a major example. The prosperity gospel and the word faith movement. I mean, this movement is exposed as the exact error of the Gentiles.
It really is.
They adopt the view that positive confessions, or specifically worded demands, possess some kind of creative, almost magical force. The idea is that God is bound to perform something, healing, financial blessing, whatever, if a believer says the right verbal formula often enough, with the right level of intensity, and with enough faith.
The sources are pretty blunt on this. Slogans like name it and claim it or speak it into existence treat God not as a sovereign father, but as a cosmic servant who is limited by human verbal formulas.
It completely reverses the order of creation and sovereignty.
It does. The speaker, through their words, attempts to generate the power required to obligate God. And that is the definition of verbal magic. It's the theological twin of the prophets of Baal shouting at their God.
And Jesus' counter is so devastatingly simple.
It is. The Father already knows what you need, so the force of your speech is irrelevant to his willingness. He gives according to his perfect understanding of what we truly need, not the volume or specificity of our demands.
That makes the distinction so much clearer. The prosperity gospel requires exhausting effort in finding the exact, powerful words. True prayer requires restful trust in the one who already knows the need and the solution. But the Gentile error also shows up in more subtle institutional ways, like in ritualism and legalism.
Right.
This is when you fall into the trap of trusting in the doing of the prayer. Set formulas, prescribed times, mechanical recitation, like using counting beads or specific daily quotas, rather than trusting in the Father's character.
The internal logic here becomes something like, if I press the right sequence of spiritual buttons, if I reach the required number of prayers per day, then grace will be dispensed automatically. It's an exercise in scoring spiritual performance.
Measuring whether you've earned a hearing through precise adherence to form.
And that functional approach is a kind of baptized form of paganism. It assumes that your repetitive effort is what breaks through to God, not the simple confidence that he hears because of who Christ is. When we are consumed by worrying about the length, the vocabulary, or the emotional intensity of our prayer, we're reintroducing that pagan logic that we have earn a hearing.
And there's one more, a final subtle error within what we might call evangelical pragmatism.
This one can be tricky.
It is, because it isn't usually about verbal magic, but about effort. This is the functional belief that God is somehow limited until enough prayer releases him to act, or that sheer intensity and duration are necessary to secure his attention.
We've all heard this, haven't we, in prayer campaigns? If 1,000 people pray for 1 hour, then God will act.
Right. And while mobilizing prayer is a good thing, the underlying theology can be flawed. It can suggest that we're trying to push a reluctant or inert deity over the line through human effort.
Which denies the Father's prior knowledge and willingness to act simply because he is good and sovereign. It makes God dependent on the quantity of human energy.
This brings us to a vital distinction we have to make, because Jesus clearly commends persistence in other places, like the parable of the persistent widow. So we need to distinguish between babbling and persistence.
A very key distinction.
This is a point of frequent confusion for people. If repetitive prayer is pagan, why does Jesus tell that parable of the persistent widow who just keeps returning to the unjust judge?
Because Jesus condemns vain repetition. The pagan babbling that tries to compel a reluctant God through verbal force in a single sitting, assuming he's asleep or indifferent. That's the salesperson trying to force a closure. But Scripture commends persistence. And persistence is childlike perseverance that returns to the Father repeatedly, not because we doubt his knowledge, but because we continually acknowledge our dependence and our confidence in him.
So the persistent widow wasn't trying to change the judge's mind.
No, she was simply expressing the undeniable reality of her need to someone who had the power to meet it. She was resting in confidence that he could act.
So the distinction is in the motive and the object. Babbling says, I have to break through this barrier using my words.
While persistence says, I rely on the Father's goodness, so I will continue to come to him until he, in his wisdom, acts or directs me otherwise. One is an act of compulsion. The other is an act of confident dependence.
Okay, that's really helpful. So let's turn this into actionable practice for you, for the listener. What are the practical implications for personal prayer when we really grasp that the Father already knows?
I think first, we gain the freedom to shift from informing God to entrusting our situation to God. When you begin your private prayer, you can quiet your anxiety right away by just acknowledging that God is already fully aware of your situation, your feelings, your needs. That simple recognition just quiets the pressure to perfectly articulate everything.
And second, we can hold our requests with an open hand. Since he is the Father and he distinguishes between our, cravings and necessities, we submit our desires to his wisdom.
Our prayer doesn't end with a demand. It ends with a submission. You know this need better than I do. Not my will, but yours be done.
And third, we gain freedom from the tyranny of sort of spiritual scoring.
Oh, that's a big one.
We can resist judging our prayer based on the minutes we spent or the emotional intensity we felt. If distraction comes, we don't try to compensate by rattling off more words or forcing a feeling. We can simply confess our weakness to the Father who already knows our frailty.
That's real freedom.
It is. So what about corporate prayer? That's where the pressure to perform is often the highest.
For corporate prayer, the implications are just as significant. We have to maintain an awareness of the primary audience. The prayer being offered is to the Father, not to the human listeners. This is the safeguard against that religious theater we talked about.
So how do we do that practically?
Well, the sources suggest using what they call the solitude test when you prepare for public prayer. Ask yourself, if I were completely alone with God right now, would I talk this way?
That's a great question.
If the language you're about to use is complex, or full of jargon, or maybe it's instructional to the congregation, or it's clearly designed to impress the person next to you, then it's likely being shaped by a desire for human approval, the horizontal error, and it's moving away from simple communion.
So that means aiming for clarity, reverence, and warmth over any kind of spectacle in public settings. The sources note that keeping corporate prayers focused and comparatively simple is actually an act of obedience to Christ's teaching, not an act of theological immaturity.
And it allows the congregation to truly follow along and say amen, rather than being forced to endure a theological monologue or a performance.
So this deep dive brings us to a singular and I think very relieving conclusion. True prayer, grounded in Matthew 6.7 through 8, is neither performance for men nor pressure on God. It's simple, honest communication with a Father who is omniscient and perfectly willing to hear.
And the main purpose of Jesus' teaching here is to bring us comfort. He's telling us that the relationship is secure. We don't have to claw our way into the presence of God. We're already invited. We don't have to convince him to love us. He already does.
So we face a choice, really, every time we bow our heads. Where we adopt the exhausting posture of the Gentiles, speaking as if everything depends on the cleverness of our words, our volume, our length, our eloquence, or will we rest in the steady, knowing character of the one who hears us?
And because the Father knows what you need before you ask him, the true benefit of prayer is not about getting the specific answer we want. It's about the deep change that comes from repeatedly, consciously confessing our need and our dependence to the one who knows what we need better than we know ourselves. The call is clear. Fewer empty words and deeper, more confident, childlike faith.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We hope this knowledge frees you to pray with restful boldness.